Healthy boundaries are important. They keep us safe, and that includes in a spiritual context as well. And it also includes the boundaries that we have to place on ourselves when it comes to potentially wanting to judge others unfavorably. In the pasuk in this week's parasha, which tells us that the Levim have to camp around the Mishkan, and then then the Eibish's anger will not be directed at the Jewish people. So it's Rashi pulls out of that pasuk these words, that there will not be anger. And as Mefarish, he explains what it means is, if you do follow my instructions, there will not be anger against the Jewish people. But if you don't follow my instructions, which means that you allow non-Kohanim and Levim to participate in the Avodah, then there will be anger from Hashem. So we have to understand this. Rashi's told us numerous times that there's a principle in Torah which is, as miklalav ato shomea, when the Torah tells us something in the negative, you can deduce what the positive is going to be. So surely we could work this out. If the pasuk tells us that if we listen to what the Eibishter says, there will not be anger, there's the negative. Then you can appreciate the positive, meaning the positive consequence, that the Eibishter will positively punish people, that if we don't listen to what the Eibishter says, there will be anger. What's Rashi telling us that we don't already know from the pasuk? If you don't listen, the Eibishter is going to be angry. Now, even if you want to try and stretch it and say what Rashi is trying to highlight, not just that there's another side to the story. If you don't follow the rules, there will be Hashem's anger. Now, it's not the ganze Kavanah from the pasuk, but rather that this is why we have this pasuk. So it doesn't hand them oynesh to spell out the consequence for those people who ignore the Eibishter's instruction. That if you don't listen, there will be Hashem's anger. Because telling us that if we follow Hashem's mitzvahs, there will not be anger, that's not a surprise. Obviously, if you follow mitzvahs, there's not going to be anger. So maybe Rashi is trying to highlight that the purpose of the pasuk is to tell us if we ignore the instruction, there will be anger. So even if we go with that, is still nachatz nit movement. It still doesn't make sense because the language that Rashi uses seems very extravagant. What's the arichas haloshin in Rashi? Why does Rashi use so many words to tell us a simple principle? If you follow my instructions, lo yeh ketzev. There won't be anger. And if you don't follow my instructions, then he spells out what that means. That non-Levim will participate in the avodah, then yeh ketzev, there will be anger. Rashi had talking about kids, so surely Rashi could have said it much shorter, simpler. Lo yeh ketzev. There won't be anger. That's the pasuk. But if you don't follow the instruction, there will be anger. Wow, how simple is that? Like we see Rashi says in Pasha Shmini about Aaron and his sons mourning the loss of Nadav and Avihu, don't grow your hair long. If you follow that instruction, you won't die. Says Rashi, but if you ignore the instruction and you grow your hair long or tear your clothing, you will die. Very simple. Should have done a simple explanation here too. So the Mepharshim try to answer, as the chiddush from Rashi though is that what Rashi is illustrating here is not to tell us the obvious, that if you ignore Hashem's instruction, there will be that anger that is avoided if you follow the instruction. But rather to illustrate who it's directed at. In other words, if you just read the pasuk at your own pace or your own reading, you might think we're talking here about the subject of the pasuk, who is the Levim, because the beginning of the pasuk was that the Levim have to camp around the Mishkan. And therefore you might think, that if the Levim camp around the Mishkan, there will not be anger against the Jewish people. But then you'd understand V'im Lav, and if they ignore the instruction, and you'd think that ignoring the instruction means if the Levim do not place themselves as an encampment around the Mishkan specifically, then there'll be anger, and it sounds like the anger would be directed at the Levim. So as Rashi Shelek them Pirish, Rashi has to explain that that's inaccurate. On his Mefarish, he explains, not following the instruction means you allow non-Levim into the space to do part of the Avodah. Which actually then tells us that the anger that could be avoided or potentially precipitated is anger, as discussed in the previous pasuk where it said Vazar HaKorev Yumos, that if a non-Levi or non-Kohen participates in the avodah, they will die. As if you consider Zorim Bavidasim Zoi, and Rashi is linking those two psukim to say that if the Levim don't protect the space from non-Levim coming in, then the Eibish's anger is going to be directed at the Yidden, not just at the Levim. But if you go with that explanation, there's still questions unanswered. Number one, Aleph. Kanal. Why does Rashi have so much verbiage over here? In Tasuke Mitzvoisai. Why does it have to say, if you follow my instructions, lo yiyah there will not be anger? My kamashmanan, what are you telling us? Obviously, if you don't follow the Eibish's instructions, that's when the anger is going to come. He should have just gone straight to the point, which is, and if they do go into service, there will be anger. Number two, even if Rashi has to first tell us that if you listen, there's no anger, why does Rashi say, if you follow my mitzvahs? Without telling us which mitzvah. Because is it the mitzvah of camping, or is it the mitzvah of keeping the yidden away from the avodah? Surely Rashi should have matched the positive and the negative parts of the pasuk. He should have said, if you prevent non-Levim from coming into the avodah, lo yiyah, there won't be anger. And then that matches up with his last point, which is ha'im yikonsu. But if Yidden do come in, yiyah, there will be anger. There would be a way that everything kind of balances out. And thirdly, Rashi. Let's look at the actual language that Rashi used. It's different to the pasuk. That non-Levim will enter into the avodah. It doesn't seem to make sense. Rashi typically uses language that is already used in the pasuk. So from Friedik and pasuk, so why here is Rashi changing from the language the pasuk already used in the previous pasuk, which was v'hazar hakorev, if a non-Levi comes close to the avodah lavidosim zoi, on zakchi konsazarim be'avidosim zoi. Instead of saying if a non-Levi approaches the avodah, they have had the Eibish's anger. Instead, he says if they enter into the avodah. Also, why is Rashi using the plural? If foreigners, even one foreigner, surely, who gets involved in the avodah, will arouse Hashem's anger. So before we can understand that, let's look at the rest of Rashi's commentary. Then Rashi continues to tell us that we see an example of where the Eibish's anger was ignited against the Jewish people when, in the story of Korach, the pasuk tells us ki yotza haketzev begomer, that Eibish's anger came out against the Jewish people. So now it's in ganze nicht verstandig. That really doesn't seem to have any place in this pirush. Number one, Aleph. What's Rashi adding to the perspective by telling us the story of Korach? Do we need proof to say that if the Eibishter warns us that if you transgress, there's going to be anger, it's actually going to happen? You need to prove to me that the Eibishter is going to keep his word, follow through on his threats? The bigger question is, how is the story of Korach proof to our topic? Surely it has nothing to do zum Teichen von dem pasuk with what's discussed in our pasuk. When the Eibishter got angry with the Yidden at the time of Korach, is that so it's not because non-Levim were participating in avodah. Actually, this anger was expressed after the Korach debacle ended, when the people complained, Moshe, you killed Jewish people. Because that's what happened with Korach. Furthermore, even the punishment that afflicted those 250 participants in Korach's rebellion who brought the Keteris, and they all died. What they did, bringing the Keteris, is not the same as what we're talking about over here, allowing non-Levim into the Levim's avodah. That was Kohanim's avodah. Right? Psukim, because here we say, it doesn't say in deep Psukim. Psukim, Tidan, Reden, Vegen Avodas Halevim, Ayradas HaMishkan, Vakamosa, in Shmiras HaMishkan. The context of these Psukim we're reading here is about the jobs that the Levim had. To put up the Mishkan, take down the Mishkan, guard the Mishkan. Whereas in the story of Korach, it was individuals who are not Kohanim, even though they were some of them Leviim trying to do the avoid of Kohanim. Not the same message. Why are you comparing to Korach? As Rashi is nice and bringing out Dugma if the meaning from Ketzef Oynesh, and it'd be really far-fetched to say, well, because Rashi wants to illustrate what Ketzef, anger, punishment looks like, even though the context is completely different. So why is Rashi going into the Korach story here? Some Mefarshim sagen, the are Mefarshim explain. As Dinin is in Rashi, Rashi is speaking here as a continuation of something he told us earlier when it says that any non-Kohen Levi should not participate in the Avodah. Rashi is Meforish. There Rashi explains that Yumas, Hazara Korev Yumas, that if a non-Levi participates in the Avodah, he will die, bidei shamayim. That's the Eibishter's business to execute. In other words, he's not going to go to the courts. So the question to pose to Rashi over here is, how do you know from the context of the pasuk that this is not somebody who then gets taken to the Beis Din and judged and executed? How do you know it's in the Eibishter's hands? To the contrary, if in pasuk v'gam be'olav yumas in Parshas Mishpatim, in the story of an ox that becomes a muad that is now habituated to goring and now gores and kills a person, so what happens? It says, the pasuk over there says that the owner will die. And there is Rashi Meforish, bidei shamayim, he'll die in the Eibishter's hands. Yochel bidei adam, and if you thought that he had to go to the courts, Tamarem Chuda is a pasuk. Therefore, the Meforshim say, well, the Meforshim pointing out that there's nothing in the pasuk inherently that tells us that it's Misa bidei shamayim unless you have proof from elsewhere. Therefore, if then bring Rashi do, as Melen to stop from pasuk v'lo yeketzef. Therefore, the Mefarshim tell us that's why Rashi quotes the story of Korach, because the anger and punishment that happened in the Korach story is bidei shamayim. Was meint is bidei shamayim? So the story of Korach will illustrate us that ketzef means a punishment that is meted out from on high. Was Korach is the die makriv aktor is given bidei shamayim. Because we see that the punishment of those who brought the Keteris, which is what we're referencing over here, is that the Eibishter killed them. Therefore, the Mefarshim say that's how Rashi needed to include the story of Korach, so that we would know over here, Hazara Korev Yumas, which is Ketzef, that actually means Misa Bidei Shamayim and not in front of the courts. The Rebbe is not particularly satisfied with that explanation. It's all very well to say that in the previous pasuk, that there's lack of clarity as to what Yumas means. But here, in this Pirush, Rashi does not even allude to the fact that he's referencing back to the story of Hazara Korev Yumas. On from Pashas L'Shein Rashi Dois Mashma, the simple language Rashi uses here implies, as the Rai from Isakerchis after Metzminyan, Azebi Konstantar Babidosim Zoy Yaketzef. If you really want to read what Rashi is saying, he's saying if a non-Levi will participate in the Avodah, there'll be anger, which we're interpreting now as potentially that the person's going to die. And that's what he's linking to Korach, not what type of death. So in order to understand what's going on over here with Rashi, we have to completely reinterpret how we're understanding what Rashi is telling us. And what's going to help us understand this is to pay attention to the order in which the psukim are presented. So we have one pasuk that says if a non-Levi participates in the avodah, they'll die, and then we have another pasuk that says that if you protect the environment, there won't be anger from Hashem. In between the two is a Torah mafsik mitten pasuk. The Torah puts in another pasuk, which is that the Jewish people all had a camp in their appropriate camps under their banners. And then we have our pasuk, which starts also not about preventing non-Levim from serving, but rather where the Levim are going to camp. Why is the camp important? So now that you've interrupted the conversation about not causing a situation where a non-Levi is doing avodah and therefore has to die, now that you've gone off onto the subject about where everybody camps, what's the anger associated with a camp? If you're saying the anger here is referencing back to the pasuk that said a non-Levi should not involve himself in the avodah, and therefore the target of the anger would be the Yidden and not the Levim, well, then we have a number of questions. Why in the middle of that conversation do you start describing the camp? wegen dem Kemach Hanoya from Bnei Yisrael, where the Jews have to camp, zwischen die zwei Psukim, was sein and If you have two Psukim that are identical, the Torah would never wedge in between them something which is completely off topic. The Monish from Azara Korev Lavidosam. So if both Psukim are carrying the theme of the punishment of a non-Levi who gets involved in the Avodah, why would the Torah interrupt that by telling us how they camped? Bay is Tata Psukim Lomelon. And why do I need two Psukim to say the same thing? Vos is Mosef de Veloye Ketzev, Noch Vazara Korev Yumas. If you read, I have a pasuk that says a non-Levi who serves in does the Avodah is going to die. What are you adding by saying, and if you prevent him from coming, there's not going to be anger? And if you want to say, actually, the Lo Yeketzev is not directed at the non-Levi who might get involved in the Avodah, but it's directed at the Levim themselves, that would address both of our questions, why there's a break and why the pasuk is actually now saying two different things, not two psukim saying the same thing. As in which case the message would be, if the Levim do not camp where they're supposed to as a perimeter around the Mishkan, even if that does not cause a non-Levi to participate, that will already get the Eibishter angry. And in that context, Ketzev does not mean death by the hand of Hashem, it just means some kind of punishment. We know that the Levim are the Eibishter's kind of private legion. They're very close to the Eibishter, as he says in a number of occasions. And therefore the message over here, this pasuk perhaps is, if the Levim do not camp where they're supposed to, they're not going to be as close as they should be, and they will experience some anger from Hashem. So if that is the explanation, it's doch noch mit kosher. All it does is it raises even bigger questions. There's pasuk sagt meferish v'lei ketzev ala das b'nei Yisrael. The Torah we have very clearly says that if the Levim camp where they're supposed to, there's not going to be anger against whom? Against the Yidden. Doesn't say Levim. That implies that this is an avera of the Jews that we're trying to avoid, not an avera of the Levim that we're trying to avoid. So how do we understand this? Why is there a pasuk about no Zor should come serve in the Mishkan? Then a different pasuk that says that if you protect them, there won't be ketzev. And in the middle of the story of the camp, the whole thing doesn't seem to make sense. That's why Rashi gives us so much information. And he tells us, if you follow my instructions, lo yeh ketzev, there won't be anger. And if you ignore those instructions, which means that you allow non-Levim to participate in this avodah, yeh ketzev, then there will be anger. In other words, Rashi is now tackling this apparent contradiction between how the psukim are set up. When does the Torah say there will not be anger? If the Levim camp around the Mishkan as they should. Why is that relevant? Because if the Levim are positioned where they need to be, that will prevent anger against, not the Levim, against the Eden. What does that mean? Again, Rashi said, if you follow my instructions, meaning if you follow all of the instructions that are included in this entire section of Chumash, which is primarily about where the Levim should camp, around the Mishkan. Come on, and we'll unpack that further. Dan v'lo yeh ketzev. If the Levim follow the encampment that they should, there won't be anger. Ve'im lav, and if you don't follow, which means if you don't follow the Eibishter's instruction and don't camp where you're supposed to, so you open the possibility that a zar will, or zarim in the plural, will serve. And that will cause anger against the Jewish people. Let's explain what Rashi is actually telling us. The Nakuda of the parasha is, the thrust and point of this parasha is appoint the Levim into positions, roles that they play around the Mishkan, and they have to serve the Mishkan, which is Atziv v'ashoreif de Havdolo und die Gevulois, was der Eibishter hat eingestellt zwischen den Levim und Yisraelim. The thrust of this parasha is that you have to respect the boundaries that the Eibishter put between the Levim and the rest of the nation. If you respect those boundaries, you'll never have a situation of a non-Levi going where they shouldn't, doing what they shouldn't. That's why the Torah here says, the The principle is everybody has to be in their place, in their camp, under their banner. Das nicht bloß zu bewahren und vermeiden, der Minion from Hazara Korev, not only to prevent people from engaging in the avodah when they shouldn't, as only come to turn avodah salavia, that a non-Kohen should do the avodah of a Levi. No, it's an independent principle. It's a generic principle in Judaism. As we must anhalten, die Havdolos und Gvulos bei dem Bnei Israel. There are boundaries within the Jewish community. Respect those boundaries. Every Shevet has their place. Every set of Shvatim under their degel has their place. The Levim have their place. Respect that. Then in that context, the Torah tells us, yes, everybody has to have their place. And the Levim's place is around the Mishkan, and that way there won't be anger. The pasuk is mamshech in dem chema von open die eingestellte mechitzes, and then the Torah says, now that we understand that everybody has their space with their boundaries, then we can see how serious it is if you don't follow those boundaries. Those are the boundaries. Respect those boundaries, keep everybody where they should, and you guarantee that there won't be anger from Hashem. And das is Rashi Madgish B'Lashoinoi. Rashi emphasizes that with the language, Im Tasuka Mitzvosai, if you follow my instructions, which means Kima Mechitzes, you keep the barriers between each group, then Lo Yeketzef, there won't be anger. And Rashi knows that we can deduce from the negative what the positive is. As Bitala Mechitzes is Gorim Ketzev. We could deduce that if you break down those boundaries, those healthy boundaries between groups, that will stimulate anger from Hashem. Not dermot is the Ketzev not bekoyach, but stimulating anger just means there's the potential for anger. But what's going to make that anger actualized? If people actually now cross over and get involved in the Levim's avodah, then there'll be anger. It's only when you get to that point that the breakdown in healthy boundaries now actually leads to people being where they shouldn't and doing things that they're not assigned to do, then there's really going to be anger. Laut dem wird man verstehen, für was Rashi ist meshane b'lishoinoi und anstatt zu nutzen l'shoin hakos v'hazor hakoret. That will explain why Rashi is coming from a different perspective. The Torah said zor, singular. One zor comes forward, yumos. Rashi, on the other hand, Zakta Shikansu Zorim Bavidosam Zoy. He says Zorim, foreigners, in the plural. Why? Because the pasuk Hazor HaKorev Yumos is a different message to our pasuk V'lo Yeketze. Der friedige pasuk redt wegen dem einisch Proti von Hazor Proti, was es begangen dem Chet von Korev Bavidosam Zoy. The earlier pasuk, that was talking about an individual who gets punished as an individual for having transgressed individually and gone to serve in the Levim's avodah. The avodah was stated in dem pasuk, Pirik Vakomas HaMishkan, which means in that pasuk it was describing that the Levim are the ones who are supposed to dismantle and erect the Mishkan. This guy went and got involved. He has transgressed. He deserves to die. And the Fash state that's why the pasuk over there is referring to a single foreigner. Is also the avodah from Pirik Vakomas HaMishkan, because even one person who gets involved in either erecting or dismantling the Mishkan, if they are not a Levi, they've transgressed. But the avodah Rashi is referring to over here, where the pasuk is talking about how you protect from anger. But that has to be in the context of the avodah described in this pasuk, which is not about the Mishkan. It's not about the assembly of the Mishkan. Rather, it's about where everybody camps. That tells us, as es Tony sein Bitte la mechitzes bichlal machne Yisrael und machne Levim darf sein obgeteilt basunder. You can't break down the boundaries. The Jewish camp has to be in this area, and the Levim camp has to be in that area, and nobody can cross over. Therefore, if you're talking about where people are going to camp, you must be talking about the plural. An individual is not a camp. Let's say that one guy decided he's going to pitch his tent in the middle of the Levim's machne. You can't say that now we have an encampment within the Levim's encampment. No. In order to have an encampment, there have to be multiple people. Therefore, Rashi has to say, Yikonzu Zorim in the plural. And therefore, Rashi does not use the same pasuk as in the previous pasuk sorry, the same language as in the previous pasuk, where it said Hazar HaKorev, because they're talking about a person who comes into the space of Avodah. But rather here is Tzu Yikonsu. We're talking about people who enter. This is not just coming close to serve, but entering a designated area. Here, the pasuk is talking about camping in the Levium's encampment. No, you can't say machne. There, the correct term is not to say they come close. You're not coming close. You're coming into their space. You're trespassing. But if I'm talking about working in the Mishkan, working in an avodah, there I can say korev. You're coming into a job that's not yours. And that eventually helps us to understand why the proof from Korach. If we were just talking about doing avodah, doesn't match up. This is the avodah of the Levim. Korach was the avodah of Kohanim. But if we're talking about breaking down the boundaries that separate the various elements of the Jewish community, then Korach's story is a very appropriate story. Rashi is damit oisen zu bringen a raya of die zwei Ktsovis anal siv daled. Rashi wants to illustrate the two extremes over here. At the bita mechitz is greda, on the one extreme, you broke down the boundaries mandated by the Torah. Just the fact that you are no longer doing things as the Eibishter instructed, is shein gerem haketzev. That already stimulates some anger from the Eibishter. But as we mentioned, that anger is not yet going to harm anybody. When will the anger actually come into effect? That is that's when people actually break the rules. Not just that there's the potential for breaking the rules because we've broken down the mechitzas, but they've actually stepped into a role which is not theirs. And that's exactly what happened Ma'aser Korach. The chet from Korach is given, was hat gewollt mevatel sein, die Havdolis bei ihnen. Korach's whole intention was break down the barriers that create the hierarchy of Judaism. There should be no difference between a Kohen and a Levi and Israel. Wie sein Tainer, like he verbalized, everybody's holy. Why are you elevating yourself over everybody else? On the chet, if alle Eden. The minute Korach did that, that stimulated the potential anger that the Eibishter had against the whole Jewish people. That the Eibishter tells Moshe and Aaron, step away from the community because it's going to wipe everybody out. But that's not what happens in practice. Even though Korach was a charismatic person who was able to schlep the entire community behind him, is a ketzer nit given before. But the fact is, the Eibishter didn't punish everybody, didn't express that anger towards everybody. As Moshe and Aaron said, that you're going to have one person sinning, Korach, and your anger is going to be unleashed on the entire people. Ketzer, the same word we're looking for. Only after the 250 people actually crossed the boundary and brought Keteris, which they should never have done because they're not Kohanim. Which means now it's not just a theoretical blurring of the lines between groups, but now they're actually behaving accordingly. They're actually breaking the law. As that if a person who is not from the descendants of Aaron should come to bring Keteris, the Torah tells us that is an offense. And even after that, Jews were complaining about it. Then the potential for anger that was already in place because the boundaries had been blurred, now is Aris before the Yotzak Ketzev Gomer, that actually comes out into the open and actually harms people. So that's what Rashi is obviously illustrating to us, that you've got to protect, you've got to create the healthy boundaries. If you don't, you're already putting everybody at risk, and then if somebody crosses over because you've allowed flexible boundaries and they actually transgress, then that risk becomes real. The Rebbe extracts out of this story just how careful we have to be in the way that we look at and certainly the way we judge other people. Look what happened over here. Korach got the entire Jewish people riled up against Moshe Rabbeinu. Von deswegen is noch nicht given kein Yotzak Ketzev von Lifnei Hashem, and yet that was not enough for the Eibishter to actually activate his anger. Noch mehr, not only that. As long as Korach's argument was just verbal, und das hat sich nicht ausgedrückt in einem Meise Befehl and hadn't yet translated into behavior, Zafir of Kirch war das noch nicht gekommen, even Kirch wasn't punished, and his followers were not punished. Dafke, wenn sie es geworden der Meise Befehl nach der Asara Chamura, it's only when they crossed the line and they actually broke the law and brought the Ketores, even though they were warned of the severity of that choice. Also haben gebracht Ketores. They actually brought the Ketores. Then is geworden der Ketzef. Then there was real anger. First, there was anger against them, and they were swallowed up by the earth. And then the Makriv actors were burnt. And then there was a Magaifa that affected everybody else who complained. Und therefore hat man Eira, which teaches us a lesson. Let's say that there's a Jew for whatever reason who does not guard themselves from inappropriate behaviors. As long as that has not yet translated into an actual rebellion against Hashem, this Yid still finds favor in Hashem's eyes. So there's no anger yet. And to the contrary, the Eibush has tremendous patience. And the Eibush will help that person to get back in line. Und in an Eifem von Chen und Ava, as es Tshuvaton, they will shower him with love and grace that he'll get into Tshuva. Und wenn an over nechbet lifnei abayirchula, that person could become beloved to the Eibishter. So if that's how the Eibishter is to another person, we certainly should look at another person. And until they've actually broken across the line, done something absolutely terrible, we should accept them and encourage them and give them the opportunity to come back online.